Big Shaq walks into his own VIP party, only to be told he doesn't belong. A wealthy socialite, blinded by power and privilege, demands security remove him. But when the truth comes out, the entire room is left speechless, and what happens next changes everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The night was alive with elegance, the kind of luxury that shimmered under golden chandeliers and echoed in the soft clinking of champagne glasses. The elite of the city had gathered at the Caldwell Grand Hotel, a towering symbol of wealth and exclusivity. It was the perfect venue for a night meant to give back, hosted by none other than Shaquille O'Neal, a towering presence both in stature and generosity. Shaq's name alone carried weight, not just as a basketball legend, but as a man of the people. Over the years, he had poured millions into charity, funding scholarships, building schools, and supporting underprivileged youth. But tonight was different. This was his annual VIP charity gala, an event where the worlds of celebrity, business, and philanthropy collided. A night where the rich had no choice but to rub shoulders with those they often ignored, the kids from struggling neighborhoods, the single mothers striving for a better future, the unsung community heroes. Shaq stood in the center of the grand ballroom, effortlessly commanding the room in his signature tailored suit. He wasn't just another rich man throwing money at a cause, he was the cause. His presence wasn't about prestige, it was about purpose. He moved through the crowd with warmth, shaking hands, sharing laughs, making sure everyone, from billionaires to the busboys, felt welcome. At the far end of the room, standing beneath a towering ice sculpture of a phoenix, Victoria Caldwell watched. She didn't belong to the class of people who gave back. She belonged to the class that collected. A fourth-generation heiress, she had never worked a day in her life, nor had she ever questioned the power her family's name carried. The Caldwell Grand Hotel was a part of her family empire, which meant in her mind that this event, Shaq's event, belonged to her. Victoria didn't like the way Shaq carried himself. Not because of who he was, but because of what he represented. He was too big, too casual, too comfortable in a world that should have made him feel small. A man like him, black, built like a warrior, standing among the elite as if he were one of them. It unsettled her. She didn't express it outright, not yet, but her eyes followed him through the room, cold and disapproving. Meanwhile, Marcus and Maya, a married couple who had been personally impacted by Shaq's charity, stood by the buffet, whispering as they watched Victoria's sour expression. "She looks like she just smelled something bad," Maya muttered, sipping her champagne. Marcus smirked. "She probably just realized she's at a party where people actually care about others." They weren't the only ones who noticed the undercurrent of tension. While the rest of the guests engaged in cheerful conversation, Victoria's presence felt like a storm cloud waiting to break. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Shaq approached the main stage, a grand, elevated platform where a silent auction was set up. Ethan Carter, a young, sharp-witted journalist covering the event, adjusted his tie and stepped closer. He knew Shaq was about to give his opening remarks, but before Shaq could even reach the mic, Victoria made her move. She strode toward the stage, heels clicking against the marble floor, her practiced smile barely concealing the disdain brewing underneath. Standing just feet away from Shaq, she turned to Carter Reynolds, the venue's general manager, and whispered something in his ear. Carter's face tensed. The whispering didn't go unnoticed. Maya and Marcus exchanged glances. Ethan raised an eyebrow, sensing a story. And Shaq, who had dealt with these microaggressions all his life, felt it. He paused, his eyes locking onto Victoria's for the briefest moment. Then, Victoria did something bold. She leaned in slightly, and with a voice dipped in polished arrogance, said just loud enough for him to hear, "I think you might be in the wrong place." Silence. A sharp pause in the atmosphere, like the split second before a glass shatters on the floor. Shaq's expression didn't change, but inside, he felt something he hadn't in years, a familiar quiet sting. He had built this event, funded this night, opened his arms to all. And yet here was a woman who looked at him and saw nothing but an outsider. Before he could respond, Carter, the manager, cleared his throat nervously. He had known Victoria for years. He also knew what she was implying. And in a moment of spinelessness, he hesitated. "Mr. O'Neal," Carter said carefully, his eyes darting to Victoria before settling on Shaq. "I, just wanted to confirm that you're on the guest list." The words hit harder than any insult. A slow murmur rippled through the crowd. People were watching now. Some were entertained. Some were appalled. Some waited to see how Big Shaq, a man known for his grace, would handle this quiet but unmistakable insult. Victoria folded her arms, lips curling into a smirk. She had done what she set out to do, make him feel small. But Shaquille O'Neal was not a small man. He exhaled slowly, taking in the moment, then stepped forward until he stood towering over Victoria. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone demanded attention. With a calm, steady gaze, he said the only words that needed to be said. "I'm not a guest. I'm the host." The air in the room changed. A collective gasp. Someone stifled a laugh. Marcus grinned. Maya nearly choked on her drink. Ethan scribbled something in his notepad, sensing the makings of a viral headline. Victoria's expression faltered, but only for a second. Then, in true socialite fashion, she tilted her head and forced a chuckle, as if it had all been an innocent mistake. "Oh, my apologies," she said lightly. "I just assumed—" Shaq didn't let her finish. "I know what you assumed." His voice was still calm, controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge underneath. Victoria's smile flickered, struggling to hold. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a man like him. Shaq let the silence hang for a moment, before finally turning to Carter, who still stood there, looking mortified. "Everything good now?" Shaq asked, his tone polite but undeniably firm. Carter swallowed hard, nodding quickly. Yes, of course, Mr. O'Neal. My apologies. Please, continue." Shaq didn't acknowledge him further. Instead, he simply walked to the microphone, adjusted his cuffs, and began his speech. The moment was over, but the ripples of it had just begun. Victoria didn't move. She stood frozen, her face a careful mask, but inside, she burned. Not because of what Shaq had said, but because of what she saw in the crowd. People, important people, were watching her differently now. The night was still young, but one thing was certain. This party had just become more than just a charity gala. It had become a battleground. And Victoria Caldwell wasn't done yet. The ballroom buzzed with conversation, the scent of fine wine and expensive perfume mixing with the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. The grand charity gala was in full swing, with guests moving seamlessly between silent auction tables, a live jazz band playing in the corner, and servers balancing silver trays of hors d'oeuvres. The night was an elegant spectacle, a showcase of wealth wrapped in the illusion of generosity. At the heart of it all, Shaquille O'Neal stood with his usual easy presence, chatting with Marcus and Maya near the main stage. Despite the earlier tension with Victoria Caldwell, he had let it roll off his back. He had spent a lifetime dealing with people like her, people who judged him before they knew him, people who saw his presence as an intrusion rather than a contribution. Marcus chuckled at something Shaq said, shaking his head. "Man, I swear you could turn any conversation into a stand-up routine." "That's because life's funny," Shaq replied, taking a sip of his drink. "You either laugh or let it eat you alive." But as much as Shaq exuded calm, Victoria Caldwell was still watching. Standing near the VIP section, she held a glass of wine delicately between her manicured fingers, her sharp gaze scanning the room before landing on Shaq again. She wasn't the type to let things go. To her, power wasn't just about wealth. It was about control. And right now, she felt like she was losing it. Her irritation simmered beneath a carefully practiced smile as she turned to Carter Reynolds, the hotel's general manager, who had been hovering nearby all night, eager to please but hesitant to take a firm stance on anything. "Carter," she said, her voice smooth but edged with impatience. "I don't know how this happened, but it seems we have an issue with security letting certain people into the VIP section." Carter stiffened, his brows knitting together. Mrs. Caldwell," Mr. O'Neal is the host of the event. He's not a guest, She waved a dismissive hand. I know who he is, Carter. That's not the point. Her tone was low, sharp. There are expectations for a night like this, standards. And he's not exactly what our donors are used to. Carter swallowed. He knew exactly what she meant. She didn't have to say it outright. Victoria took a slow sip of her wine before continuing. This is an exclusive space, a place where the right people feel comfortable. You understand? Carter hesitated, glancing toward Shaq. The man was beloved, respected, and the entire night revolved around his generosity. But Victoria was powerful, and she had connections that could make or break his career. Victoria leaned in slightly, voice smooth as silk. Just politely remind him where the general guests should be mingling. No need for a scene. Carter hesitated, then with a small nod, caved. Shaq was mid-conversation when he felt Carter approaching. Mr. O'Neal? Carter's voice was tentative, forced into politeness. Shaq turned, giving him an easy nod. What's up, Carter? The room hadn't gone silent, but a few ears tuned in. Maya instinctively stepped closer, sensing something was off. Carter cleared his throat, eyes flicking toward Victoria, who watched with a small, victorious smile. I just need to confirm that this section is reserved for our VIP guests and donors. There's an area set up for the main attendees where I'm sure you'd be more comfortable. A pause, a slow beat of realization. Shaq looked down at Carter, not because he wanted to, but because he physically towered over him. The moment felt absurd. More comfortable? Shaq echoed, his deep voice carrying a weight that made Carter shift uncomfortably. It's just... Carter hesitated. A lot of our donors have certain expectations for this space, and we want to keep everything running smoothly. Shaq's expression didn't change, but Maya's eyes darkened with anger. Are you... She started, but Shaq gently raised a hand to stop her. He wasn't going to let this become bigger than it needed to be. Instead, he let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. Carter, my man, do you know whose name is on that banner right there? Carter followed his gaze to the massive Shaquille O'Neal Foundation logo hanging above the stage. His face flushed. Yeah. Shaq continued, his voice light but unmistakably firm. I think I'll stay right here. Carter looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. He turned to Victoria, clearly trapped between two forces. Victoria, however, wasn't backing down. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble. Mr. O'Neal, I'm sure you understand that events like these require a certain level of decorum. It's nothing personal. Shaq let out another chuckle. This time it wasn't friendly. See, that's the funny thing about people like you, he said, looking directly at her now. You dress it up in fancy words, but I know exactly what you mean. Victoria's face remained neutral, but something flashed in her eyes. She had never been spoken to like this in her life. Shaq took a step closer, lowering his voice so only she and Carter could hear. You think because you own this building, you own the people in it. But I'll tell you something, Victoria. Your name isn't the one bringing in the money tonight. These donors, these VIPs, they came because of me. Victoria stiffened, but before she could respond, a voice cut through the tension. Is there a problem here? All three turned to see Ethan Carter, the young journalist, standing just a few feet away, his press badge glinting under the soft lights. He wasn't holding a camera, but the way he studied them felt just as dangerous. Victoria immediately softened her expression, shifting into socialite mode. Of course not, she said smoothly, flashing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. We were just clarifying event details. Shaq smirked. Oh, we were definitely clarifying something. Carter Reynolds, now sweating bullets, muttered a quick apology before practically running off. Victoria, however, didn't leave. She held Shaq's gaze, refusing to be the one to back down. But Shaq? He was done with her. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Victoria standing there, gripping her champagne flute so tightly her knuckles turned white. The night wasn't over, and Victoria Caldwell wasn't finished. The tension in the ballroom was almost tangible, like an invisible force humming beneath the chandeliers. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations. all of it dulled as something unspoken but undeniable unfolded near the VIP section. Shaquille O'Neal stood still, his calm but unwavering presence a stark contrast to the unease radiating from Carter Reynolds, the hotel's general manager. The man looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. His eyes darted between Shaq and Victoria Caldwell, the latter standing just a few feet away, her lips curled into a victorious little smirk. Shaq had seen this play before. Carter cleared his throat, gripping the edge of his suit jacket as if it might somehow anchor him. Mr. O'Neal, he began cautiously, forcing a polite smile. I need to confirm your... He hesitated. He knew exactly how absurd this was. The man standing before him wasn't just on the guest list. He was the reason this event even existed. And yet, the weight of Victoria's gaze on his back, the silent expectations of people like her, forced the words from his mouth. Your invitation. The room shifted. A ripple of disbelief passed through the nearby guests. Some turned their heads just enough to catch the exchange, their whispers hushed but unmistakable. Did he just... No way. That's Shaquille O'Neal. What is happening? Others exchanged nervous glances, their polite smiles stiffening as they pretended not to notice. Because noticing meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant choosing a side. At the buffet table, Marcus and Maya froze mid-conversation. Maya's grip tightened around her champagne flute. Are you kidding me? She whispered, her voice sharp. Marcus exhaled slowly. Let's see how he plays it. The sting of it wasn't new to Shaq. He had lived through it before, on the streets as a kid, in the NBA locker rooms where people questioned if he was too much, in boardrooms where executives assumed he was just another athlete with money, but no mind for business. Even here, in a room built with his generosity, he was still expected to prove his worth. But Shaq didn't react, not right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch, let Carter wither under the weight of his own words. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, Shaq adjusted his cufflinks. A small gesture, but somehow it made him seem even bigger. A mountain, unshaken. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, but it carried the weight of the moment. I'm not a guest, he said, letting each word land with precision. A beat. Then, the final blow. Steady, unshakable. I'm the host. The air in the room changed, gasps. A sharp inhale from somewhere in the crowd. A stifled chuckle from someone who couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Victoria froze. For the first time that evening, the cool, calculated arrogance she carried cracked, just slightly. She had expected pushback. What she hadn't expected was this level of clarity, of unwavering self-possession. Carter, on the other hand, looked like he had just been handed a live grenade. His mouth opened, then closed, his brain scrambling for damage control. Oh, of course, Mr. O'Neal, he stammered, laughing nervously, his face burning with embarrassment. I wasn't implying that you weren't, Shaq didn't bother waiting for him to finish. The moment had already passed. Instead, he turned slightly toward Victoria, meeting her gaze with a measured look. She tilted her head slightly, her expression smoothing back into its usual mask of detachment. But there was something different now. She wasn't in control of this moment anymore, and she knew it. Across the room, Ethan Carter, the sharp-eyed journalist who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, immediately scribbled something in his notebook. He had sensed it earlier, that undercurrent of tension, the way Victoria's presence seemed to challenge the very fabric of the night. Now he had a headline. The guests had different reactions. Some were thrilled by what had just happened, others were simply uncomfortable, and some tried to pretend they hadn't just witnessed a power dynamic collapse in real time. Marcus turned to Maya, shaking his head in admiration. Man doesn't even have to raise his voice. Maya exhaled, still furious, but nodded. That's why he's Shaq. Victoria finally moved, exhaling as she took a measured sip of her wine. Then, slowly, she turned on her heel and walked away, but not in defeat. No, this wasn't over. Not yet. The moment had settled, but the weight of it lingered. Shaq's words, "I'm not a guest, I'm the host," had rippled through the ballroom like a shockwave, leaving behind an uneasy silence. It wasn't just the sheer confidence of his response that unsettled people. It was the implication of the moment itself. The realization that someone like Victoria Caldwell, a woman so used to commanding rooms with nothing but her name, had just been publicly, undeniably, put in her place. And she hated it. Victoria stood near the champagne tower, her manicured fingers wrapped tightly around the stem of her glass. Her jaw was set, lips pursed, her usually effortless poise strained under the weight of humiliation. She had expected Shaq to react with anger, frustration, anything that would justify her disdain. Instead, he had done something far worse. He had made her look ridiculous. And now? Now she had two choices. She could apologize, or she could fight back. Victoria had never been the apologizing type. Taking a slow breath, she plastered on a practiced smile and turned toward a small group of well-dressed donors who had been watching carefully. Her voice was light, airy, dismissive, as if nothing of importance had just happened. "Well," she sighed dramatically, "I suppose some people don't understand that there's a certain expectation for events like this." The words were soft, but their intended meaning was sharp. A few in the group shifted uncomfortably. Others, the ones who thrived in the same elitist ecosystem, nodded subtly. But what Victoria didn't notice was that the moment had already escaped her control. Across the room, Ethan Carter's phone was already buzzing. The young journalist had been watching everything, his instincts sharp. Moments like these, raw, unfiltered displays of power and bias, were the kind that set the internet on fire, and the fire had already started. A few guests had discreetly recorded the exchange, the short clip of Victoria dismissing Shaq, Carter hesitating, and Shaq's powerful response was already making its rounds on social media. A local influencer had posted the clip with the caption, "This woman really tried to kick Shaquille O'Neal out of his own charity event? Disgusting." Within minutes, the comments flooded in. How does this kind of stuff still happen? Victoria Caldwell is exactly what's wrong with high society. Big Shaq handled that like a king. The internet had chosen its sides, and Victoria was losing. Meanwhile, Shaq had stepped aside, speaking quietly with Maya and Marcus near the silent auction tables. Maya was still fuming, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You know she's not done, right?" she muttered. "That woman doesn't take public embarrassment lightly." Marcus nodded. "She's going to spin this somehow. People like her always do." Shaq exhaled slowly. He had seen the way Victoria had spoken to the donors after the moment had passed. She was still working the room, still spinning her narrative. And now he had a choice to make. Ethan Carter, sensing that the real story wasn't over yet, took a breath and made his move. He approached Victoria, his notebook in hand, the press badge around his neck clearly visible. "Mrs. Caldwell," he began, his tone polite but pointed. "Would you care to clarify your comments about Mr. O'Neal's presence here tonight?" Victoria turned to him, her expression still controlled, but there was an edge of irritation in her eyes. "I don't see why this is even a discussion," she said smoothly. "It was simply a misunderstanding." Ethan's lips quirked slightly. "A misunderstanding? You asked the general manager to remove the man who organized and funded this event." Victoria took a slow sip of her champagne. "I was under the impression that we were maintaining a certain level of exclusivity in the VIP area. I had no idea Mr. O'Neal was so involved." Ethan raised an eyebrow. She was doubling down. "So, to clarify," he pressed, "you're saying Shaquille O'Neal, one of the most recognizable figures in the country, wasn't visibly important enough for you to assume he belonged?" Victoria's smile tightened. "I simply believed there were certain standards for these types of events." Ethan knew exactly what she meant, and so did the people watching, because now more guests had gathered nearby, pretending not to listen but hanging on to every word. And just a few feet away, Shaq had seen enough. Maya's voice was urgent. "Shaq, you need to shut this down. She's making this worse." Marcus nodded. "We've got security here. Just say the word and she's gone." Shaq looked at them both, then turned his gaze toward Victoria, who was still spinning her carefully curated narrative. And that's when he made his choice. He didn't call security. He didn't need to. Instead, he walked forward, slowly but deliberately, toward the conversation. Victoria noticed immediately, her posture straightening, her fingers tightening around her champagne glass. Ethan stepped aside, sensing something bigger was about to happen. Shaq stopped just a few feet from Victoria, his towering presence impossible to ignore. And then, with the same calm, measured voice he had used before, he spoke. "I've spent my whole life walking into rooms where people like you didn't think I belonged." Victoria blinked. The crowd watching grew completely silent. "I've played for crowds who didn't want me on their teams," Shaq continued. "I've sat in meetings where people assumed I was just a dumb athlete. And I've built businesses where investors didn't take me seriously because I didn't fit their idea of what power should look like." He let the words hang for a moment. "But you know what's funny?" Shaq said, tilting his head slightly. "No matter how many times people like you try to decide where I do and don't belong, I'm still here." A single beat of silence. Then, applause. It started with Maya and Marcus, but within seconds, others in the room began clapping. A few guests nodded approvingly. Even some of the wealthier donors, people who normally stayed quiet in situations like this, couldn't deny what they had just witnessed. Victoria, for the first time that evening, looked rattled. Her mask of control slipped just for a second as she realized she had lost. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It wasn't just about a guest list or an exclusive space. It was about power. And tonight, Shaq had taken it back. Without another word, Victoria turned, setting her champagne flute down on a passing tray before walking swiftly toward the exit. But even as she disappeared, the moment remained. The internet was already ablaze. The story was already spreading, and Shaquille O'Neal didn't just leave the night victorious. He left knowing that people like Victoria could no longer control the spaces they once owned. The night had taken an unexpected turn. What had started as a celebration of generosity had morphed into an uncomfortable confrontation. A moment where privilege and bias had been laid bare in front of an audience too wealthy, too well-mannered to react honestly. But now, as Victoria Caldwell disappeared into the crowd, tension still crackled in the air. Conversations whispered behind raised glasses. Eyes flickered between Shaquille O'Neal and the stage, as if waiting to see what would happen next. Shaq felt the weight of it. He had shut Victoria down, but the real battle wasn't with her. It was with the system that had built rooms like this, rooms where men like him still had to justify their presence. He exhaled, then turned toward the stage. Maya caught his arm. "Shaq." "I know," he said, voice steady. "I got this." Without another word, he moved forward, stepping onto the grand stage, his towering frame commanding attention. The live jazz band instinctively lowered their instruments, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The room, still full of billionaires, CEOs, and socialites who thrived in exclusivity, fell into silence. Then, Shaq took the mic. He didn't start with anger. He didn't start with blame. He started with a story. "You know, when I was a kid," Shaq began, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom, "I was always told I was too big." A pause. People shifted in their seats, listening. Too big to play with the other kids, too big to be gentle, too big to be anything but a problem. His gaze swept over the crowd, landing briefly on Carter Reynolds, the hotel's general manager, who was standing near the back, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "As I got older, people stopped calling me too big," Shaq continued. "Instead, they started saying I was too different to fit in certain places, too different to be anything but an athlete, too different to be taken seriously in rooms like this." The words settled over the audience like a heavy truth they had never been forced to face. Maya and Marcus watched from the sidelines, their fists clenched. Ethan Carter, the young journalist, leaned forward slightly, his pen hovering over his notepad. Even some of the guests who had quietly sided with Victoria earlier now looked uncomfortable. And that was exactly what Shaq wanted. He let the silence stretch before continuing. "You see," Shaq said, his voice still calm but carrying weight, "I was always expected to stay in my lane." A dry chuckle escaped his lips. "Play basketball, entertain, maybe sell a few sneakers, but never own anything. Never control the spaces I walked into. Never be the one signing the checks instead of cashing them." Heads nodded, some in agreement, some in realization. "But here's the thing," he said, his voice dropping slightly, forcing the room to listen closer. "The moment you start making other people uncomfortable, they start questioning whether you belong at all." Shaq looked directly toward the VIP section, where Victoria had been holding court all night. She was gone now, but her presence still lingered. "They don't say it outright," he continued. "They don't say, 'Hey, you're not welcome.'" He shook his head. "No, they do it differently." A slow murmur rippled through the crowd. "They ask if you're on the guest list." Silence. A single cough from somewhere in the back. "They ask if you're in the right place. They ask if you understand the expectations of a place like this." Shaq exhaled, letting the weight of his words sink in. "And when that doesn't work?" His eyes darkened slightly. "They find another way to remind you that you were never supposed to be here in the first place." The audience had never been so quiet. Some of them, especially the older, wealthier guests, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were not used to being called out. Not in this way. Not in a space where they had always assumed they were the heroes, the ones who gave back, the ones who threw charity galas and wrote checks to feel righteous. But now they were being confronted with the fact that money wasn't enough, that the world they benefited from was built to exclude, and some of them didn't like that. A man in a crisp black suit, one of Victoria's longtime acquaintances, leaned toward his wife, whispering, "This is getting uncomfortable." Maya, overhearing, turned to glare at him. "It's supposed to be." Meanwhile, in the back of the room, Carter Reynolds stood frozen. He had spent his career catering to people like Victoria. He had made his entire livelihood on knowing who to please, when to turn a blind eye, when to step in just enough to keep things running smoothly. But tonight, he had messed up. He had humiliated the most powerful man in this room. Not because he wanted to, but because he had been conditioned to side with people like Victoria. And now, as he stood there, listening to Shaq tear down the entire foundation that people like him operated on, he felt something gnawing at his chest. By now, Victoria was long gone. She had left the moment she realized that the night was no longer in her control. She hadn't been dragged out. She hadn't been humiliated with security escorting her away. No, she had simply lost. And that was a far worse punishment. Because now, her absence spoke louder than her presence ever had. She had walked away from the conversation, and in doing so, she had proven everything Shaq was saying. She had excluded herself. Shaq looked over the audience one last time. "You want to know the truth?" he asked, his voice softer now. A hush fell over the room. "I don't need to be in rooms like this." Murmurs. Confusion. "Rooms like this need me." Silence. "You want to talk about charity?" Shaq continued. "Then let's talk about it. Because real charity isn't about writing a check so you can go home feeling good about yourself." The words cut through the crowd like a blade. Real charity is about changing the system. It's about making sure that the people you're helping aren't just guests in a world that was never built for them. It's about making sure they don't have to prove they belong. The applause came slowly at first. A few hesitant claps, then a few more. Then, a full standing ovation. Not from everyone. Not from the people who had spent their entire lives pretending that these problems didn't exist, but from the ones who needed to hear it the most. Shaq didn't smile. This wasn't about applause. This was about a conversation that could no longer be ignored. As he stepped down from the stage, Maya clapped him on the back. "That," she said, shaking her head, "was a masterstroke." Shaq just sighed. "I just told the truth." And tonight, the truth had been louder than money, louder than power, louder than any name on a building. It had been undeniable. The applause had barely faded when the whispers started. Shaq had owned the night. His speech had been more than just words. It had been a reckoning, a moment where power shifted in a way that Victoria Caldwell had never anticipated. But Victoria wasn't done. She had left the ballroom seething, her carefully crafted social dominance shattered in front of people who mattered. She had spent years curating her influence, bending the right ears, controlling who belonged and who didn't. And tonight, she had lost. She wasn't the type to accept loss easily. Tucked away in a dimly lit corner of the venue's private lounge, Victoria gripped her phone with white-knuckled rage. The ice in her untouched cocktail had melted, the condensation leaving a damp ring on the polished table. The line rang twice before a deep, measured voice answered. Victoria. It was Walter Harrington, the owner of Caldwell Grand Hotel. He was a powerful man, old money, with interests in real estate, politics, and anything else that kept him at the top. Walter, Victoria purred, regaining some of her composure. We have a problem. A pause. What kind of problem? The kind that threatens our image. The kind that involves an event being hosted in our most prestigious venue by the wrong kind of people. Walter exhaled. You know I don't like messy situations, Victoria. Oh, I know, she said smoothly, eyes narrowing. That's why I'm bringing you a solution. There's a contractual loophole in the venue agreement. Something about last-minute capacity changes and fire code compliance. If you step in now, quietly, you can legally shut the event down. Walter went silent. Victoria leaned back, swirling her drink. It's just business, Walter. This situation is bad optics. If we don't control it now, this could snowball. The wrong kind of attention, the wrong kind of headlines. Another pause. Then, I'll look into it. Victoria smiled. Checkmate. In another part of the lounge, Marcus and Maya had no intention of eavesdropping. They had stepped in for a break, hoping to catch their breath after one of the most chaotic nights they'd ever witnessed. But as soon as they heard Victoria's voice, sharp, clipped, calculating, they froze. Maya grabbed Marcus's wrist. Did you hear that? She whispered. Marcus's jaw tightened. She's trying to shut the event down. Maya's mind raced. We have to warn Shaq. Marcus nodded. There was no time to waste. By the time they reached the main ballroom, Shaq was already speaking with key donors, solidifying partnerships, ensuring that tonight's momentum wasn't wasted. Maya didn't bother with pleasantries. Shaq, we have a problem. Shaq immediately knew. Victoria? She's calling in favors, Marcus confirmed. She found some kind of legal loophole to shut this whole thing down. If Walter Harrington steps in, this event is over. Shaq sighed, rubbing his temple. Of course she wasn't going to go down quietly. She's hitting you where it hurts, Marcus added. Legally. She knows you won't cause a scene, so she's playing behind the scenes. Shaq's mind worked quickly. He had two choices. Fight back publicly, call her out, make it a bigger story. Find another way to shut this down, quietly, without giving Victoria more control over the narrative. Shaq wasn't the type to panic. He had faced worse in his life. But this wasn't about him. This was about the people this event was meant to help. He needed a solution. Maybe I can help. A smooth, confident voice cut through the conversation. Shaq turned to see a tall, silver-haired man in a dark suit approaching with a measured stride. Matthias Caldwell, Victoria's estranged older brother. Shaq had heard of him, but had never interacted with him directly. Unlike Victoria, Matthias had distanced himself from the family's elitism. He had made his fortune in venture capital, had a reputation for being calculating but fair. Shaq eyed him carefully. And why would you want to help? Matthias gave a small smirk. Let's just say Victoria has spent years making enemies within her own family. He glanced toward the exit where Victoria had last been seen. And I enjoy watching her lose. Shaq crossed his arms. So, what's your angle? Matthias chuckled. You don't trust me. Good. But here's the thing. You don't have time to play this clean. Victoria is smart, and she knows how to manipulate people like Walter Harrington. Maya stepped forward. So, what's your plan? Matthias pulled out his phone, tapping the screen twice before turning it toward them. An email from Walter Harrington. It was a forwarded message from Victoria outlining her plan to shut the event down. Shaq scanned it, then looked back at Matthias. How'd you get this? Matthias smirked. Walter and I go way back. Let's just say he was already having second thoughts about siding with Victoria. I just helped him make up his mind. Shaq knew an opportunity when he saw one. He turned to Marcus. How fast can we get Ethan Carter on this? Marcus immediately pulled out his phone. Already on it. Matthias raised an eyebrow. You're going to use the press? Shaq smiled. I don't need to fight dirty. I just need the truth to get out before Victoria gets to spin it. The media strikes first. By the time Victoria returned, smug and ready to gloat, she was met with a very different atmosphere. Guests were checking their phones, whispers spreading through the room. Ethan Carter had already published the story. The headline was brutal. Exposed, elite socialite tries to shut down Shaquille O'Neal's charity event to save her own image. The article included screenshots of Victoria's email to Walter Harrington. The damage was instant. By the time Victoria reached Walter, he wouldn't even look at her. You went too far, Victoria, he muttered, voice cold. You dragged me into a mess I want nothing to do with. Victoria paled. Walter, He walked away. For the first time that night, Victoria had no control. Shaq didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Instead, he took the mic one last time. There's a lesson in all this, he said. People who spend their lives trying to control others will always lose in the end. The room erupted in applause. Victoria stormed out. Matthias, watching from the side, chuckled. Well played. Shaq gave a small nod. Thanks for the assist. Matthias extended a hand. Consider this the start of something interesting. Shaq shook it. The night wasn't just a victory, it was a shift in power. And Victoria Caldwell? She was finally on the outside looking in. The night had shifted. Victoria Caldwell had stormed out, her influence crumbling faster than she could contain it. But Shaq knew that people like her didn't just disappear. They regrouped, plotted, and found new ways to stay in power. This wasn't just about one woman's arrogance. This was about a system, and if Victoria had done it to him, she had done it before. The moment Ethan Carter's article went live, the internet caught fire. People weren't just reacting to what happened that night. They were digging deeper. Social media sleuths, reporters, and even old business associates began speaking up. And what they found wasn't pretty. Victoria had a pattern. A black CEO of a rising tech company mysteriously denied a high-profile investment opportunity after meeting with Victoria. A Latina philanthropist pushed out of a major fundraiser due to concerns about guest expectations, a phrase eerily similar to what she had used on Shaq. A prominent female judge who quietly resigned from a private board after a conflict with Victoria. No details ever made public. The pieces connected too perfectly. And now, the world was watching. In the middle of it all was Carter Reynolds, the venue's general manager. He sat in his office, the glow of his laptop screen casting shadows on his face. His inbox was flooded with messages, journalists, lawyers, even his own staff asking what the hotel's stance was. He had worked under Victoria for years, had watched her control rooms with a mere glance, manipulate situations without ever getting her hands dirty. And now, she was exposed. A voice interrupted his thoughts. You look like hell. Carter turned to see Matthias Caldwell standing in the doorway, his usual confident smirk in place. Carter exhaled. I'm guessing you already know. Matthias stepped inside, hands in his pockets. That my sister is a walking PR disaster? Yeah. He tilted his head. But the real question is, what are you going to do about it? Carter clenched his jaw. You don't get it. She's powerful. She has connections. Matthias chuckled. Not anymore. He leaned in slightly. You've been silent long enough, Carter. You stood by and watched her tear people down. That silence makes you complicit. Carter stiffened. Matthias sighed, straightening. You have two choices. You can stay loyal to a sinking ship, or you can help clean up the mess you helped make. Carter swallowed hard. He already knew the answer. Shaq wasn't interested in revenge. Revenge was loud, temporary, and gave people like Victoria the chance to play the victim. What he needed was strategy. So when a major news network reached out, asking for an exclusive interview about the night's events, Shaq saw his opportunity. Not to destroy Victoria, but to make sure no one else could ever do what she did again. The interview took place in a sleek, modern studio, the city skyline glowing in the background. Shaq sat across from Lisa Monroe, a respected journalist known for cutting through the noise. She didn't waste time. "Shaq," she began, leaning forward, "the world saw what happened at your charity event. But this isn't just about one night, is it?" Shaq exhaled, steady and measured. "No, it's not." Lisa nodded. "People have come forward, CEOs, philanthropists, politicians, all claiming they were pushed out, disrespected, or blocked from opportunities by Victoria Caldwell." Shaq's gaze didn't waver. "That doesn't surprise me." Lisa held up her tablet. "This list of incidents goes back years. Some people tried to fight back but lost everything. Others stayed silent out of fear. Why do you think she got away with it for so long?" Shaq's voice was calm, but the weight behind it was undeniable. "Because she knew the game," he said. "She knew how to be polite with her racism, how to wrap it in words like standards and exclusivity, how to humiliate people just enough to remind them they didn't belong, without ever saying it outright." Lisa let the words hang in the air. Then she turned to the camera. "There's someone here who can confirm just how deep this goes." The screen cut to a live feed, and Carter Reynolds appeared. Carter sat in a separate studio, looking like a man caught between guilt and relief. Lisa turned back to Shaq. "You didn't know he was coming forward tonight, did you?" Shaq shook his head. "No, I didn't." Lisa faced Carter. "Carter, you were Victoria Caldwell's right hand for years. What made you finally speak up?" Carter took a deep breath. "Because I let it happen. I let it happen for too long." Lisa pressed further. "And what exactly did you let happen?" Carter's hands clenched. "I watched her push out powerful black business owners, women, anyone who didn't fit her version of elite. She knew exactly where the lines were, and she danced on them perfectly." Shaq sat back, studying the man who had once tried to remove him from his own event. Lisa continued. "Carter, was there ever a moment where you knew, without a doubt, that she was doing this deliberately?" Carter closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, his voice was quiet. "She told me once, when we were setting up a private gala, that some spaces aren't meant to be shared." Lisa's breath hitched slightly. Shaq's jaw tightened. Carter looked into the camera. "I stayed quiet because it was easier, because I wanted to keep my job. But I watched her ruin people's careers. I watched her nearly ruin Shaq's night. And now I'm done protecting her." The broadcast went viral within minutes. Victoria Caldwell, once an untouchable figure, became a cautionary tale. Businesses cut ties. Invitations to high-profile events were rescinded. The hotel, under pressure, removed her name from all affiliations. She had built her world on power and perception. And now, both were gone. As the interview wrapped up, Lisa asked Shaq one last question. "Do you think Victoria will ever take responsibility for what she's done?" Shaq exhaled, then shook his head. "People like her don't apologize. They disappear." Lisa studied him. "So what happens now?" Shaq looked directly into the camera. "Now we make sure no one else takes her place." The screen faded to black, and the world had officially changed. The world had turned against Victoria Caldwell. Not because she had been caught in a single moment of arrogance, but because the world had finally seen the pattern of who she truly was. The whispers had turned into headlines. The quiet judgment of the elite had transformed into public exile. And for the first time in her life, Victoria was powerless. Victoria sat in the back seat of her town car, staring at the city lights blurring past her window. Her phone sat in her lap, the screen dark. No calls, no texts. Just days ago she had been untouchable. Now, she was a liability. Her name was being quietly removed from guest lists. Her business associates had started distancing themselves. Even Walter Harrington, the man who had once trusted her judgment, had cut off contact entirely. But the worst of it? The silence from people who had once begged for her approval. The donors, the board members, the socialites she had carefully curated into her circle. They weren't defending her. Because deep down they had always known. They had just never been forced to admit it. Now, with receipts in hand and the world watching, they couldn't afford to be on the wrong side of the narrative. She let out a slow breath, gripping the leather seat beneath her. Her whole life had been built on perception, power, and control. And now she had none of it. Back at the Caldwell Grand Hotel, the energy of the night had shifted entirely. The confrontation was over. Victoria was gone. But instead of the night ending in chaos, it had transformed into something unexpected. Momentum. Purpose. A cause bigger than just one night. Shaq stood near the silent auction tables, watching as guests who had once been hesitant were now fully engaged. Donations had doubled in the last hour alone. People weren't just throwing money at the event anymore. They were listening, asking questions, stepping forward to do more. And Shaq? He didn't feel satisfaction in Victoria's downfall. There was no victory in watching someone self-destruct. That wasn't the goal. It never had been. As Maya approached, holding a fresh drink in hand, she studied Shaq carefully. "You're quiet." Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't know, Maya. I should be happy, right? She got what was coming to her." Maya scoffed. "Shaq, she spent her entire life making sure people like you weren't in rooms like this. She deserved everything that happened tonight." "Maybe," Shaq said. "But if she doesn't learn anything from it, then what's the point?" Maya sighed, looking at the bustling room. "So what do you want to do? Send her a handwritten lesson plan on how not to be a racist elitist?" Shaq let out a small chuckle but shook his head. "Nah. But I do want to give her something most people like her don't give to others." Maya raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Shaq looked at her. "A chance." The next morning, Victoria sat at her dining room table, staring at an email she never expected to receive. It was from Shaquille O'Neal. She almost didn't open it. But curiosity, or maybe something deeper, forced her to click. The message was simple. "Victoria, people like you never fall because they don't think they can. You thought you owned the room, but the truth is, you were always just borrowing it. I'm not reaching out to gloat. I don't need to. I'm reaching out because I believe people can change if they want to. But that part? That's up to you. You've lost everything except for one thing, the chance to do better. If you ever want to talk about what that actually looks like, you know where to find me." Shaq. Victoria stared at the screen, jaw clenched. Anger. Humiliation. A flicker of something unfamiliar. She didn't respond. Not yet. But she didn't delete the email either. And that was the beginning of something no one saw coming. Back at the hotel, the gala had become more than an event. It was a statement, a shift. Marcus stood next to Ethan Carter, scanning the final donation numbers. "This is insane," Marcus muttered. "We just hit triple what we raised last year." Ethan smirked. "Guess people finally got the message." Maya joined them, shaking her head in disbelief. "It's not just the donations," she said. "People are asking how they can be involved beyond tonight. They're actually trying to change things." Shaq overheard, nodding. That was always the real goal. Because this wasn't about Victoria Caldwell losing. It was about everyone else finally waking up. And as the night came to a close, one thing was clear. This wasn't just a victory. It was a reckoning. And the world would never be the same again. The fallout from the gala didn't settle quietly. It echoed. By morning, Shaq's speech had gone viral. Clips of his words were spreading across social media, news outlets dissecting every moment. The footage of Victoria Caldwell's humiliation had been shared, analyzed, debated, some defending her, most condemning her. But what stood out more than her downfall was what came after. A shift, a conversation, a reckoning. For years, spaces like this had operated on unspoken rules. Who belonged, who didn't, who got to be seen, who had to prove themselves. Shaq hadn't just stood up for himself that night. He had forced people to look at the system itself, and the system wasn't holding up. At the Caldwell Grand Hotel, a different kind of meeting was happening behind closed doors. Carter Reynolds sat at the long mahogany conference table, staring at the stack of documents in front of him. His resignation letter sat on top, unsigned, but the decision had already been made. He had spent years playing the game, protecting the interests of the elite, silencing his own conscience. Last night, he had watched everything crumble. And the worst part? He had been a part of it. Victoria was gone, but the stain she left behind remained. The hotel's board of directors needed a new direction, someone with integrity, someone who wouldn't let another Victoria rise again. The door opened, and Eleanor Matthews stepped in, sharp, ethical, a woman who had fought for inclusivity in high-end business spaces for years. She had seen what Victoria did from the outside, and now, she was here to make sure it never happened again. She sat across from Carter, folding her hands. "You know this is the right move." Carter sighed, nodding. "Yeah." He picked up a pen, staring at the paper for a moment before signing his name at the bottom. A weight lifted. Eleanor took the letter and leaned back. "You've got a long way to go, Carter, but recognizing the damage is a start." Carter exhaled. "What happens now?" Eleanor's expression was firm. "We rebuild, and this time, we do it right." The conversation wasn't fading. Instead, it was growing. News channels debated the implications of Shaq's moment at the gala. Activists called for more inclusivity in elite spaces. Even corporations started issuing statements, some performative, some genuine. It wasn't just about one night anymore. Shaq's words had forced people to look deeper, to ask questions, to change. Shaq watched it unfold, not with pride, but with a sense of purpose. He hadn't set out to start a movement. But maybe that's exactly what was happening. Late one evening, as Shaq sat in his home office scrolling through an endless wave of notifications, a private message appeared. It was from Matt Caldwell, Victoria's daughter. Shaq raised an eyebrow. He hadn't expected this. He clicked the message. "Mr. O'Neal, I don't know if you'll even read this, but I needed to reach out. I won't make excuses for my mother. What she did was wrong, but I need you to know, I don't want to be like her. I've spent my whole life watching her shape the world to fit her version of right. And for too long, I let myself believe that was normal. But I see it now. I see what she did. And I see what you did. I don't know what comes next for her, but I know what comes next for me. I want to do better. And if there's ever a way I can help, please let me know. Matt." Shaq read the message twice, then leaned back in his chair. The universe had a sense of irony. Victoria had spent her entire life closing doors for people like Shaq. And now, her own daughter was asking to open one. Shaq didn't respond right away. Not because he didn't believe her, but because he knew that real change takes more than just words. He would wait. And if Matt was serious about changing, then maybe, just maybe, one Caldwell would finally be on the right side of history. A week later, Shaq attended another event. A different kind of event. It wasn't a gala for the wealthy. It was a fundraiser for underprivileged youth. The same kids that events like Victoria's had always kept out. The room was full, not of billionaires and politicians, but of real people. Kids who had never been given a chance. Parents who had fought against impossible odds. Shaq stood near the back, observing. Then he saw a boy, no older than 10, standing near the entrance, staring into the VIP section. The kid wore a second-hand suit, the sleeves too long for his small frame. His hands were stuffed into his pockets, his eyes flicking between the polished tables and expensive centerpieces. He didn't step forward, because somewhere deep inside, he had already been taught that he wasn't supposed to. Shaq felt a familiar sting in his chest. He walked over, kneeling to the kid's level. "Hey, little man, you good?" The boy hesitated before nodding, but his eyes darted back to the VIP section. Shaq followed his gaze, then chuckled. "You trying to get in there?" The kid looked embarrassed, shaking his head quickly. "Nah, I don't think I'm supposed to." Shaq smiled. "Says who?" The boy blinked, unsure how to answer. Shaq held out his hand. "Come on. You belong in there just as much as anyone else." The boy hesitated, then slowly reached for Shaq's hand. And together, they stepped into the space he was never supposed to be in. No hesitation, no permission needed, because that's how it should have been all along. This wasn't just about one event. It wasn't about one woman's downfall or one speech that went viral. It was about something bigger, something that had started long before Shaq walked into that ballroom, and something that wouldn't end here. Because real change doesn't happen in one night. It happens when barriers stop feeling permanent. When kids like that boy don't even question whether they belong in powerful spaces. It happens when people like Victoria lose their grip on the world they shaped in their own image. And when people like Shaq start shaping it back. One door at a time. One invitation at a time. One step into the VIP section at a time. Because the future doesn't belong to the ones who try to keep people out. It belongs to the ones who let them in. Some moments spark conversations. Others ignite change. This isn't just about one night. It's about who gets to shape the future. The question isn't whether the world is ready for that shift. The question is, where will you stand when it happens? Because the doors are opening. Step in.